like to thank the councillors and staff for affording me the opportunity to be able to carry out this presentation on nuclear energy for Queensland, but also for Australia more broadly. I'll give you a little bit of a rundown on myself. So it was in my early 30s that my wife and I settled in the town of Blackwater, and we lived there for about 3 years. My wife was a GP out there. I was a civil engineer working in the infrastructure of the town of Blackwater on the subdivisions, water supply, sewerage, and that sort of thing, and assisting some of the mining companies out there in their infrastructure. Following that, I moved into Rockhampton, and with a contractor there, I assisted in the construction of a concrete reservoir for Gladstone City Council, as it was at that time, and then completed the earthworks at Stanwell Power Station. So over a period of about 5 years, we had quite a strong engagement with this region. It was sometime thereafter when I was working on a small weir at Eidsvold in the south of the state that I became recognised, with all of the work I was also doing overseas at the same time, that I became quite concerned about the issue of man-made climate change. And I wanted to do something about that. And I formed a relationship with a gentleman called the grandfather of climate change science, Professor James Hansen at Columbia University. He's also the director of NASA Space Goddard Institute. And James convinced me and many others that if we were to get on top of emissions, but also to do it at a low cost, nuclear would be an essential part of the mix. Mix, I say, not exclusive. So I founded this little organisation I've got called Nuclear for Climate Australia. We derive no funding from any external organisations. It's a totally voluntary effort. Along the way, I was also actually the endorsed candidate for the ALP in the seat of Goulburn in New South Wales, and unfortunately I wasn't able to convince them that we needed to be going for nuclear, but hopefully in the future that will change. So I'll come now to the presentation I've got, and this image we see at present on the screen contrasts the dilemma that we have in trying to deliver economic low-carbon energy. On the left-hand side, we see the problem we have when we have wind and solar, with their variability requiring significant amounts of gas backup and batteries and storage to deliver electricity safely into a modern industrialised economy. Industrialised is the key term here, because Gladstone, particularly with the wonderful industries you've got here, requires very reliable energy. And some people say, oh, we can have demand response to fluctuate our demand with respect to variability, but no, that really doesn't work economically very well. On the right-hand side, we have what we could get to, which is pretty much what they're doing in France right now, where they have extremely low emissions. They have about medium cost electricity in Europe. It's not the highest, certainly not the lowest. And they're running on about 70% nuclear, with a range of wind and solar and batteries and gas coming in as well. That type of reliability is the sort of thing that I'd like to discuss today. So in the content today, I'm going to go into some of the environmental aspects of wind and solar. We'll move over into a discussion about economics, how we can go through this transition to ultra low carbon, but also low cost, with nuclear plus wind plus hydro plus solar. We'll look at the share of nuclear capacity, which our analysis shows we could handle by each state. We look at reactor sites more closely and key issues in Queensland. This is the problem we're currently suffering in, particularly here we've got Clark Creek Wind Farm in central Queensland. I mean, to be perfectly honest, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Some people would like this, Some people see it as bird grinder. I happen to fall in the latter camp, which would see that the average lifespan of a Raptor flying through that lot would be in minutes, not days. It has a profound impact on the flora and fauna of the region going through the development of those. We're clearing hills, we've got massive amounts of road clearing for the construction of these, and it has a tremendous impact on the local environment when we try to industrialise our environment in this way. We see there on the left-hand side bird and bat deaths, which are occurring all the time. And on the construction of those wind farms, they are wiping out massive amounts of the fauna in those environments. Now, that environmental issue is a problem. If it was giving us some profound benefit, one might come up with a value judgment that you've got to break eggs to bake a cake. However, what we are actually seeing is it is delivering neither low-cost energy nor is it delivering ultra-low emissions. The whole hope for wind and solar was that we would end up with some form of sustainable future, yet unfortunately it's not happening. And Germany, which has tried it, and they lead us by around about a decade, we see the recent announcement by Friedrich Merz, the current German Chancellor, where he's labelled the country's complete shutdown of nuclear power as a serious strategic mistake, citing it's been a major error that's crippled their energy capacity and it's forced a reliance on coal and gas and it's given them the world's most expensive electricity. And it's driving the Germans effectively into a recession on an industrial basis. They are recognising this and they're actually going to be moving back towards some nuclear. More recently, we see the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. She is trying to promote a return to nuclear throughout Europe because they are seeing increasingly this requirement on LNG exports out of Qatar, places like that, an increasing reliance on coal, and they are not able to compete with the rest of the world industrially. She's called it a great strategic mistake, and they're trying to amend that. Australia doesn't want to follow down that path. We can't follow down that path. And our analysis, assisted by Dr. Robert Barr of Electric Power Consulting, who's the former president of the Electrical Engineering Society of Australia, has assisted me with this sort of analysis. Here we are looking at 4 different strategies. In gold, down the bottom of each column, that's the cost in cents per kilowatt hour to generate electricity. The green is the cost to distribute that electricity on the grid and in the transmission systems. The left-hand side is where the government would like to take us with what we call the step change scenario. There's a less ambitious progressive change scenario as the second column. The third column along is the sort of thing we possibly could have seen with the coalition's previous campaign over about 40% nuclear. And the best, most optimum solution for Australia would be something like what they've got in France, is the fourth column along. Now you can see at the top of each column the cost, not the price, the cost of the electricity generation. A nuclear scenario with some wind and solar is about half the cost of excluding nuclear out of the mix. But the interesting thing is to also look at the emissions. That's shown in the heavy red line, where you see that if you go for your nuclear on what we call a life cycle emissions basis, life cycle being that analysis which takes not only its emissions where you generate the electricity, but also what went into making it and what goes into disposing of it. And that we see with nuclear at high levels, we're at around about a fifth of the emissions of things like the step change scenario. That type of analysis therefore feeds into this image here. And I apologise for the complexity of it, but this is essentially a plan for the transition from our fossil fuel, existing fossil fuel base, into a nuclear base. At each point along the horizontal axis, we're going from 2023 on the left to 2060 on the right. The height of all of those elements is the amount of electricity we're producing on the national electricity market. So on the left-hand side, it's about 200 terawatt hours per year, of which Queensland's good for around about 31% of that. And on the right-hand side, where we would be in 2060. And we see a mix where on the left-hand side, we have our black coal down the bottom, brown coal transitioning into some gas. Then we have rooftop solar, utility solar. In blue, we've got wind, and in darker blue, we have hydro. And what we see is that as we integrate nuclear from around about 2040, we steadily roll out the nuclear. We get ourselves essentially to an ultra-low carbon emissions grid by 2060. And that's shown in that red trace, dropping down very dramatically as the nuclear comes in. The dotted red line shows just the emissions from burning fossil fuels, where the nuclear virtually takes you to zero from 2050. Now, I won't go through every part of this table because that can be a bit daunting. Let's just focus. This is the share. So in that previous image, the amount of nuclear one would have in 2060 would be about 24.8 gigawatts. How do you break that down by state? Well, Queensland is the third line along. It's at about 31% of the NEM demand, so you'd assign 31% of your nuclear to Queensland. In 2050, that would give you, in the fourth column along, that would give you 4 units, and in 2060, that would give you 6 units. The other states are sitting in the table. We came up to this region late last year and spent a week up here going around to a host of different sites. I'll show these on a map later, but essentially we looked at regions up around the northern part of central Queensland, from Stanmore across to the Fitzroy. We came down, then we had a look at the Gladstone region, and then went further south towards Bundaberg and Maryborough. Out of the 10 sites that we looked at, we really only need for Queensland 2 or 3 sites. Okay, so here's 10 possible locations, but of those, 2 or 3 would do the business. On this, I've put down 3 possible ones: Thompson's Point, Rod Bay, and Tandora down there, Maryborough. And we see on here, in 2050, you would have 4 units. In 2060, you'd have 6 units. There's a misprint, I believe, on your printouts. It says 7, but it's actually 6. The why I picked those 3, it's quite arbitrary actually, but because in addition to the plants, we've got to look at the transmission costing. It's good enough. You can't just build them, you've got to plug them in. And so in plugging them in, that was a method to derive a cost for plugging them into the grid. That enabled us to come up with a cost. Now, our cost is based on plants that I have visited. I've visited quite a number of nuclear plants globally over the last few years. But the plants that we're looking at are the ones shown in that image. There's SAL Units 1 and 2. I was at SAL Unit 1 in January of last year. It was a nice cold day in Korea at the time, and they were churning out 103% of their rated capacity. They love cold weather. The total cost of using those sorts of plants through to 2060 in Queensland, based on current costs, would be $72.7 billion. You'd add in about $3.9 billion for transmission, would take it to 76.6 billion. That is for a system of reactors which would last for a minimum of 8 years out to probably a century. Okay? This is an investment for a very long time, not stuff that falls over after 30 years or so. They get along on coastal locations, which I'm very strongly promoting the use of coastal locations. They get along quite well with the wildlife. And in this image, we see those sites grouped. So I've said we've got sites we could look at Stanwell, Thompson's Point, Curtis Island in the north. Then we come down to Boyne River, Tannum Sands, Hammock Hill, Rod Bay. The strong thing is that these plants would need to be able to get cooling using either extremely large estuaries or seawater cooling. You could come further down south and you'd come down to a place called Meara on the coast, Tandura or Tinninbar down towards the Mary River region. These are some views of the types of sites. And it's interesting in this one to look at, on the top right image, the size of the type of footprint that a nuclear power plant would, and this is actually scaled to the size of that coastline. So typically a 3-unit plant would be about 650 metres by about 400 metres. It's really quite a low footprint. In conclusion, large nuclear power plants are the least cost source, this is on a system-wide basis, of ultra-low carbon energy. Nuclear energy has the lowest environmental impact of all generating sources. We must learn from and collaborate with success stories, especially Canada and South Korea, both of which I've visited. And we can build these in Australia. At the very minimum, from the first few, we would be able to do 80% of their input here in Australia, and that could elevate into it. And we need to, with all urgency, get rid of the anti-nuclear legislation so we can stop procrastinating. Thank you.
We have some questions, Councillor Wagner.
You wanted some questions, so I've got a few for you. So thank you for the presentation. Can you hear me there?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, just a little bit of context here. So can you tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about the organisation and, yeah, what is your interest in this?
My interest in this is, as I stated in my introduction, my interest in this is to ensure that industrial wealth of Australia as we go forward, and to ensure we do that in a way that we protect our environment and we pass on a wealthy nation that's pretty smart for our future generations. There is no other interest apart from that.
Okay, and just your background, can you just give us a little bit of like...
Yeah, I'm a civil, I have a degree in civil engineering, a master's degree from the University of New South Wales, and I've got a master's degree in nuclear science from the Australian National University. Excellent. So that's where I actually went to do my academic understanding of the operations of these. And I've also toured probably 10 different plants globally and held quite a number of discussions with people experienced in the operations and running of nuclear power plants.
No. So would you be considered, sorry, pardon my ignorance, would you be considered expert in this area? How would you
I
position
would say
yourself?
I'm a learned armchair expert. When you sit beside the people that run plants, who understand the nuts and bolts, the foibles and the failings and the problems, I'm by no means an expert. I am sufficiently knowledgeable to assist in the debate within Australia, but no, I'm not a complete nuclear expert.
Yeah, and so has this sort of gained momentum for you? Like, are you getting other people on board? Where do you feel you're positioned at this stage? Are you starting from down here, or do you think you're actually making inroads?
It fluctuates. If one looks at the work that I and other people who are trying to do this, if we go to the sorts of statistics we saw publicly going into the last election. 12 months out from the last election, Australia was running on around about 55% in favour of nuclear. As we drew close to that election, it dropped down into the low 40s. Okay, so the Australian public has a difficulty with nuclear, and it needs a lot of the sort of discussion that we're able to have here now, so that it can go further into the community. I have a website where I'm putting all of these plans up, and I engage on social media to the best that I can to hold that discussion.
Excellent. And also, so obviously we live in an area where there's, you know, has been known to be natural disasters, cyclones and what have you, and you're identifying some sites in our region as potentials. And like for those of us that lived through Chernobyl and other disasters and grew up in an environment like no nuclear, how would you allay our fears about the potential risks, given our location? We're close to the ocean, it's the pristine barrier reef. So how would you allay our fears?
Okay, if we go to, Chernobyl wasn't near the ocean. Chernobyl was a reactor that would never have been built in the Western nation, and it was under rather unusual operations, almost negligent operation. Fukushima, where I've visited, and I've gone around Fukushima province, in Fukushima city, I took radiation readings.
Sorry, it's near the water, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in Fukushima city, there's less radiation there than in my office in Berrima. Okay. No member of the public received a high radiation dose as a result of Fukushima. No one. There have been no deaths from radiation as a result of Fukushima. 19,000 people died at Fukushima, or in that province, as a result of a tsunami that drowned them. Okay. One could say, don't populate low-lying areas in Japan. That's the more fundamental problem, not the nuclear. If anything, one could say that with those three meltdowns recording no deaths, it indicates that even in the worst possible circumstances, you end up with an energy system that doesn't kill anybody. What is happening in Fukushima with the Japanese people, and I was told by the Chief Technical Officer Advisor to the Fukushima Rehabilitation Commission, he said, Mr. Parker, what we're doing here in this rehabilitation is not informed by science. It's an act of atonement. And so you've got to petition the reality, I guess, from anxieties. And those anxieties are hard to deal with. 3 Mile Island was another one that had profound anxieties. Again, the dosages that came out of 3 Mile Island were so low that no one received any high-level radiation doses, and no one was harmed in the public.
So in our area here, like I see Rods Bay, Myra, and some other areas that have been identified. And if you haven't looked at the modelling for sea change and the encroachment of water, how have you come up with those sites? Because some of those are in those really low-lying areas that are at risk with climate change.
Yeah. Nuclear power plants are built, you elevate them above the seawater. So you don't leave them low-lying where you could get inundation. So you build a combination of seawalls and you build a combination of elevated rock platforms, and you site them at an appropriate height above sea level to insulate them from those sorts of impacts, together with seawalls. And we see that done globally. You see it done in the United Kingdom right now, where they're building them on large estuaries. You see that's at Sizewell, for example. You see it in France at Flamanville, where they've recently completed theirs. You see it in Sweden, in Finland, all around the globe. Countries are placing these on sea locations, but they put them suitably above long-term calculable heights to arrest any problems with encroachment of seawater or tsunami risk. And Australia is uniquely stable in terms of seismic activity. So we really don't have a seismic issue to be of any concern in this country.
And what about the, sorry to ask these questions because I think these are what residents, I suppose, would be asking us.
Thank you.
Your cyclones. So obviously we do have cyclones here too. So what are the risks with cyclones of having a plant like this?
A nuclear power plant is probably uniquely positioned compared to just about any other generating device to ride through a cyclone at full production. You're talking about a device here that can sustain the impact load of a 767 airliner. They face this all the time in the United States right now, particularly down in the southern parts of the US where cyclonic activity comes in and hits their nuclear plants all the time. And they ride through the massive blizzards that they're getting through the jet stream blizzards. And they ride through those. Nuclear is probably the most robust energy system you can get to tolerate weather events.
And the other one is they've got to be near the transmission grid. Obviously,
Yes.
I don't understand nuclear, so, I'm
Yes.
fairly new to this. They've got to be there. How do we transport this energy?
We would need to. That's why we've looked at the existing Queensland grid and we've looked at how we would connect the plants into that. That's to some degree why the sites were nominated on the plan that we've looked at. Probably the hub in this region is around the Gladstone switchyards, which you've got right now, and one at Baldercombe. And we would connect, for example, if you built ones at Curtis Island or at Thompson's Point, you'd connect directly into those. Likewise, Rod Bay, you'd come up from the south and connect into the existing grid. And you would build new transmission lines to connect to those grids. And those are the things we've costed. The ones further down south, if you take the existing coal plants of Callide, Stanwell and Gladstone, you take them as a generating group and you replace that group with nuclear, then it becomes basically a pull that lot out and plug this lot in to that same grid. The bigger issue is not so much this region as further south, where if you're to try to replace the coal plants and the large gas plants in the south and southwest of the state, then you need longer transmission lines down there. And so some of the transmission extensions down there would be up to 90 kilometres. So they get a bit bigger. But up here, you're talking about lengths of only about 20 or 30 kilometres. They're not particularly big.
Okay, so sorry about this, everyone. One last question. So if this did gain momentum and it was seen as something supported in our region, would you be developing this, or who would you see actually developing this?
Let's take the precedent of what we see globally. Nuclear energy in the vast majority of nations is the policy and area of influence of generally the major governments or the major state governments. And as we had in Australia with our coal plants in Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales, we saw those developed by our state governments. Now, sure, they passed over into private enterprise, but they were the initiatives of forward-thinking people in state governments at the time. And that's how one would do it in Australia. This notion that you would hang around and wait for developers to come in is a bit fanciful. You would really transition it under a combination of federal and state government, because there are federal legislations that need to be covered and energy generation is that of the state government responsibility. And so it really needs education at both those levels. Financing would be by probably federal funding because of the advantaged rates of interest that we gain by that mechanism. And that was foreshadowed by Ted O'Brien, who was the shadow energy minister in prior to the last election. Some people were a bit aghast that a Liberal guy would come up with that, but it's just the precedent of what's happened globally.
Sorry, and so what would you like us to do with this information? Like, what's our takeaway from today? What would you like us to leave?
I think the takeaway here was when we visited your aluminium smelters here, we went around, and I have existed in this community, albeit a few decades ago, understanding that Gladstone region is the industrial hub of this state. And it's got to be secured for the long term. The aluminium smelters have got to be secured. The LNG plants have got to be secured. You've got to have low cost, ultra low carbon energy to secure that industry. The community of Gladstone needs to be able to put their hand up through their elected representatives sitting here and make the case clearly to the state government of Queensland that this needs to be on the table and considered together with wind and solar. It's not a black and white either or. It's a shared deal. And that's the case that I believe needs to be made. And the industrial rebirth of Australia around a nuclear fleet would be massive. We see it in Canada, where they've got their 20 reactors in Ontario. We're seeing it in the United States now, where they're looking at rebirth. Australia needs to participate in it.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Wagner.
informative.
Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Cameron and Patrick?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, that's a pretty interesting concept you got there. We have existing coal-fired power stations across the state. Is it not an option there to retrofit them to nuclear? Is that not an option in your plan?
If I take, and I've looked at that quite clearly.
Yeah.
The key thing, if I had to pick the 10 points out of a nuclear power plant you need to do, I'd say 6 of them are cooling. They generate a lot of heat.
Yeah.
Okay. And you have to exhaust that heat into the environment. And to achieve that, you need reliable long-term cooling. And you can't go long-term by competing for freshwater inland resources. That's just, so that, in my mind, puts a big question mark over trying to do it at Callide. You'd want to do a very careful analysis on Stanwell to make sure that Fitzroy was going to hold up for what you're talking about. But that's why I've enumerated the coastal sites. Gladstone is putting its cooling water, the existing coal plant, into an estuary that I'm not sure would be large enough, but the analysis needs to be done. I won't write it off. But I think the other thing about Gladstone Power Station, it is quite close to the existing runway. And so I've got a question mark. I don't write anything off, but some sites, you look at them and you say, yep, that's a goer. Some, oh, gee, we've got to do a lot of work to make that one work. So you understand, it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, well, because Gladstone is saltwater cooled, that's
Yes.
quite unique in itself because it does have the ability to ramp up and down and adjust its supply.
It does, but you've got that large estuary there that it's dumping into. And if you're to put 2,800 megawatts of nuclear, I'm not saying it can't be done. I'd say the analysis has got to be done to underpin it.
Yes, well, the main advantage of that is, to use your term, it is already plugged in,
Yes,
which has got to be a big advantage.
correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Councillor Cameron. Councillor Patrick?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you for your presentation this morning. I do have 2 questions, and they've probably been a little bit answered on the back of Councillor Wagner's questions. But I just want to frame it from a community's point of view, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes.
So it's a little bit of a story, so I hope that's okay. So imagine Gladstone 15 to 20 years from now, maybe even 30 years from now. The harbour is bustling and industries are humming and families are still building their lives here. And we are flourishing as a community. A new energy product has been built on the outskirts of the region. Something big, something meant to power the next generation for jobs and keeps Gladstone strong. Most days everything runs smoothly. People barely think about it. Kids go to school, workers head to the port and the region keeps moving forward. But every now and again, someone wonders, what if something goes wrong, really wrong? Not because they expect it to, not because they want to stir fear, but because they care about this place, the beaches, the fishing spots, the industry that keep this town alive, and the safety of their families. They remember that Gladstone has weathered cyclones, industry incidences, and environmental challenges before. They know that big project brings big responsibilities, and they know that asking questions isn't a negativity. It's how communities stay strong and informed. So the people of Gladstone, we gather together in a town hall one evening, parents, workers, business owners, teachers and elders. They sit together not to argue but to understand. They listen to experts talk about energy, jobs and the future, which is what you are talking about. They hear about benefits and the stability and the low emissions and the long-term economic boost. But they also know that no technology is perfect and no project is risk-free. Someone stands up, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a fisherman, maybe it's a young apprentice, and asks a question everyone has quietly held in the back of their mind. If something did go wrong with a project like this, what would it mean for our region's environment, industries and our community? Not out of fear, but out of respect, because it's the right question and a responsible question, and it's a community-minded question. And it's that kind of question that deserves a clear, honest answer. And it's a question I would like to pose to you today.
Okay, thank you for that. I guess if we're going to confront our anxieties, we have to try to do that in as fair-minded and analytical way as we can. I suffer from the problem of being an engineer. And engineers, unfortunately, exist in a world of atoms up. But that doesn't necessarily address, I guess, significant numbers of people in the community who exist on anxieties, and they are not necessarily going to confront them or worry about. That's the purpose, I guess, of education and discussion about these sources of energy. If you look at the great growing areas of France, the south of France, they've got 58 nuclear power plants in France, 63 gigawatts. They've never had an issue. 100 nuclear power plants sitting in the United States, with the exception of a minor meltdown, a partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island, which had no impact on anybody. I think we would need to look at glass half full as opposed to a glass half empty. Fukushima did not harm anybody. 3 Mile Island did not harm anybody. Where do we get our information from when we develop these anxieties? You know, we need to look at both sides of the argument, and I'm not sure at present that we do that. So I can only appeal to you because I understand the subtext of what you're asking me there, and it only comes as a result of the education. I've been to MIT in Boston, and I've been presented with the demographics of community groups throughout the United States where they have had nuclear for many decades. And I can tell you, they're not that different to Australia. The same anxieties exist in different parts. On the other hand, if you go to Poland, currently they're about 70% in favour. You go to Finland, they're up very high. And so different parts of the world are more accepting. It depends on information, education. So all I can do is go into community education, but I don't have a magic bullet to existential anxieties. That's for the individual to confront their fears. They confront their fears every day when they get on a jet airliner. Okay, they accept the value proposition of I might die in this jet aircraft. Far higher chance of dying in a jet aircraft than ever having an issue with a nuclear power plant. They get in a motor car every day. vastly higher chances of coming into grief than living in a nuclear power plant. I go to Darlington nuclear power plant in the United States. There are people there living within 600 metres of the plant. They've built their houses there. That's how accepting they are. So you've really got to look at it on a case-by-case basis and confront your anxieties.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for your presentation today. Thank
Yeah.
you, councillors, for your questions. We might get back onto the rest of the agenda, but thank you for attending today, and thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us this morning.